Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're diving into a massive mystery, one that literally affects every single one of us every single day. Brace yourself, because almost everything you've read in traditional economics textbooks about money, it's deliberately confusing. Actually, a lot of it is just straight up false. When we really start digging into the historical data, all those textbook definitions completely fall apart. And honestly, this confusion isn't an accident. So today, we're going to map out the true history of money.
So I want you to completely rethink your assumptions for a second. What if everything you were taught about the history of money is just wrong? To kick off this little detective story, we actually need to travel back to 1903. Picture a tiny Pacific island called Yap. An American doctor, William Furness, goes there and is just completely baffled by their local economy. See, the people of Yap use these enormous physical objects as money, but definitely not the kind of pocket change you're used to.
These objects were massive stone discs. We're talking 4 tons of solid limestone, basically the weight of a fully grown elephant. So obviously you could move them. They just sat outside people's houses. When a trade happened, the stone stayed exactly where it was, and the village just collectively agreed, all right, that stone belongs to a new owner now. But here is the truly mind-bending part. Years earlier, a family was moving one of these massive stones across the ocean. A storm hit, and the stone sank right to the bottom of the sea. Nobody could see it, let alone touch it. But guess what? It still worked perfectly as currency. Why? Because the whole island just agreed it existed, and they agreed on exactly who owned it. The physical stone was never the point. The agreement was.
Okay, let's really dive into this, because this right here brings us to the actual definition of money. Money isn't a physical object at all. It's a measuring tool. Think of it exactly like a ruler. A ruler only works because we all agree on the measurement, right? Take a minute, for example. A minute is exactly 60 seconds, whether you're standing in Tokyo, New York, or Cairo. Nobody wakes up and decides, you know what, today a minute is 55 seconds. That rock-solid stability is what lets you plan your life. Money is supposed to be that reliable ruler, based entirely on our shared human agreement and trust.
Now, what's super fascinating here is how this completely shatters a 250-year-old delusion. Back in 1776, Adam Smith wrote that humans started out by bartering. You know, trading your fish for my bread. And then we supposedly invented money to make things easier. But as Cambridge anthropologist Caroline Humphrey points out, all the historical evidence suggests a pure barter economy literally never existed. Barter didn't come before money. It actually came after. Anthropologists have found that people only ever relied on barter as an absolute emergency backup plan when established money systems completely collapsed, like what we saw in Russia in the 1990s or Argentina in 2002.
So if barter wasn't first, what was? Well, looking at the historical timeline reveals something pretty shocking. The oldest writing we've ever discovered, from Mesopotamia, over 5,000 years ago. It's not laws, it's not poetry, it's actually debt records, scratched right into clay tablets. People simply kept a running tab of what they owed each other. And just think about the sheer gap in time here. The first metal coins didn't even show up in Lydia until 2,700 years later. Let that sink in. Human civilizations built entire cities and paid workers entirely on recorded debt and promises for over 2 millennia before the very first coin was ever struck. The coin came way after the promise. Which brings us right back to our ruler metaphor. A minute exists in nature, right? Nobody controls it. But money? Money is purely a human agreement. And here's the absolutely crucial catch. Human agreements can be changed silently without anyone ever telling you. This is exactly why, for thousands of years, ancient societies tried to tie their money to unfakeable, physical anchors, stuff like gold and silver. They desperately needed something that behaved like time itself, fixed, stable, and impossible to just print out of thin air. But what happens when you replace that solid physical anchor with paper?
Well, to answer that, let's take a trip to China during the Song Dynasty. At the time, their official money was made of iron, which, as you can imagine, was incredibly heavy and just exhausting to lug around a massive empire. So clever merchants solved this massive headache by storing the heavy iron and trading lightweight paper receipts instead. It was brilliant, pure convenience. But then, the government noticed. They took over the system, created official paper money, and quickly realized something very, very dangerous. Printing paper is a whole lot cheaper than digging up metal. So they started printing excess paper to fund some incredibly expensive wars. They effectively shrank the financial ruler for the very first time. The result? Total collapse of trust, and the people were forced right back to using that heavy iron they had tried so hard to escape.
And this perfectly illustrates a cycle that repeated centuries later in 17th century London. Let's walk step by step through exactly what happened with the London goldsmiths. Step 1. Everyday folks stored their physical gold in the goldsmith's secure vaults for a fee, and then just used the paper receipts to trade. Step 2. The goldsmith realizes, hey, this physical gold is just sitting here gathering dust, so he secretly starts lending out those receipts to other people and charges interest on them. So you're taking all the risk, but he's keeping the reward. Then comes step 3, where the goldsmith gets just a little too greedy. He's got 100 pieces of gold in the vault, but he prints out 150 paper receipts. He literally just imagines 50 extra receipts into existence. Because the real receipts and the fake ones look completely identical, the goldsmiths basically stumbled into inventing fractional reserve banking by total accident.
Now, you'd probably think that when the public caught wind of this, there'd be massive outrage and a crackdown, right? Nope. Instead, we get this wild, dramatic irony. In 1694, King William III was absolutely desperate for cash to fund his own wars. He saw exactly what the goldsmiths were pulling off and decided he wanted that exact same power. So, instead of stopping it, he officially licensed the trick. A syndicate of merchants loaned the crown money, and in exchange, they were granted an exclusive license to issue paper money, backed by nothing more than the king's promise to pay them back. The fraud didn't get shut down, it literally got a crown placed on its head. And that's the birth of the Bank of England, the granddaddy of all modern central banks.
All right, let's fast forward to the modern era, because the world tried one last desperate time to fix this broken ruler. In 1944, a new global system tied all the world's currencies to the US dollar, and the dollar was firmly anchored to physical gold at $35 an ounce. But history loves a sequel. The US quietly started printing extra dollars to cover the massive sprawling costs of overseas wars and huge domestic programs. The paper dollars piled up, but the gold in the vault sure didn't. France eventually noticed the math wasn't mathing and started demanding its physical gold back. So, instead of emptying out Fort Knox, in August 1971, President Richard Nixon went on live television and completely severed the gold anchor. Just like that, overnight, every single global currency transformed into paper, backed by absolutely nothing but trust.
I just want to pause right here for a second and let this number really sink in. 92%. If you had a crisp $100 bill in your pocket on the night of that broadcast back in 1971, today that exact same bill would only buy you about $8 worth of goods. 92% of its purchasing power has been silently, invisibly siphoned away over the last half-century. The number printed on the paper hasn't changed one bit, but the ruler you're using to measure its value, it shrank drastically.
Which brings us face to face with the reality of our modern banking system, a reality that totally contradicts the neat little theories in those textbooks. Today, a staggering 97% of all the money in existence is purely digital, and it is created directly by private banks on computer screens. Only about 3% of it is actual folding physical currency.
Think about it like this. Imagine you walk into a bank tomorrow and sign a contract for a $10,000 loan. What's crazy about this is that the banker doesn't go back to a dusty vault and grab $10,000 out of someone else's savings account. Not at all. At the exact second your pen hits that paper, your promise to repay magically becomes an asset on their books, and they simply type $10,000 into your checking account. Your signature literally creates that money out of thin air. The bank just taps a few keys on a keyboard to bring it into existence, yet they still get to collect very real interest on it.
And that little magic trick leads us straight into the ultimate mathematical trap of our entire global economy. Let's say you borrowed that $10,000, but after interest, you now owe the bank $11,000. So where does that extra $1,000 actually come from? The terrifying answer is it was never created. That interest money doesn't exist anywhere in the system. The absolute only way you can ever find that extra $1,000 to pay off your debt is if someone else goes to the bank and takes out a brand new loan. So our entire financial system requires an endless, nonstop cycle of expanding debt forever, literally just to keep from collapsing. Now, this required treadmill of ever-expanding debt is intrinsically tied to what central banks love to call price stability, which is their deliberate 2% inflation target. Look, 2% sounds small, right? Kind of harmless. But when you compound that over a lifetime, it means the real value of your hard-earned savings is chopped in half roughly every 35 years. This continuous, relentless shortening of your financial ruler, it is not an accident. It is entirely by design. So let's take a completely impartial look at who actually wins and loses in this setup. The savers? They end up carrying all the risk. Their purchasing power is literally halved every few decades. But look at the borrowers, and specifically look at governments. Constant inflation is incredibly beneficial if you're sitting on massive mountains of debt. You get to borrow money when it's strong, and you pay it back decades later when the money is incredibly weak. Those massive, unpayable government debts are just quietly inflated away into manageable chunks, and it happens at the direct expense of everyday folks trying to save for the future.
So the most crucial takeaway here is this. The endless debt, the shrinking ruler, the silent loss of your purchasing power, none of this is a glitch or a flaw in the system. This is the system. We've traced this entire story from the sunken stones of Yap Island all the way to the glowing screens of modern digital banking, and the core truth hasn't changed one bit. Money is, and always has been, just a human agreement. So I'm going to leave you with one powerful question to chew on. In our modern financial agreement, are you the one holding the ruler, or are you the one being measured by it? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning what you've been taught.